Hello, my name is Aiden Butler. I am a sophomore at Virginia Tech, minoring in history. And it is April 30th, 2022. And I have the privilege today to be speaking with Mr. David Sandgrund, a veteran of the Vietnam War and eventual member of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Mr. Sandgrund, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today.
Thank you, Aiden. The pleasure is mine.
All right. So I guess first starting out, when were you born?
December 1942.
December 1942. Okay. And how did you come to, did you have anyone participate in the U.S. military? Did you have anyone who had served in the military before your deployment to Vietnam?
Not in my immediate family. Not in my immediate family. I had uncles who had served in World War II.
All right. And were you drafted, enlisted?
Drafted.
All right. What were you doing at the time of what were you doing at the time you were drafted?
I was working for a bank in New York City called Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company, which has now become J.P. Morgan Chase after many other iterations.
So what were you initially doing? What were your initial thoughts when you heard that you had been drafted?
I guess confusion. A bit of a surprise since I had been declared as 4Y at a previous draft meeting in physical. And so I was surprised that I had been reclassified as 1A.
So what does that mean? The 4Y and 1A. What does that mean?
4Y was that you weren't eligible to be drafted for physical reasons. I'm not, and I got to tell you, I'm not quite sure what they were because they never delineated any of that. And then I guess as the draft got bigger and bigger, they started taking everybody and anybody. And so I was reclassified from 4Y to 1A.
And what was your understanding of America's involvement in Vietnam at the time you were drafted? What did you know about why there were American troops being deployed there, or why there was involvement at all?
Well, I knew pretty much in detail at that point. I was, I guess, old for a draftee. I was already 23. So I was well read on politics and involved in politics. I had already marched in a couple of anti-war demonstrations. And so I was basically opposed to what we were doing. And I thought we were wrong in our approach and our procedure.
So you talk about that you'd already actually participated in a few anti-war marches already. So did you consider ever at a time, because we've learned about this a lot of times, some draftees would go to Canada, or did you ever consider dodging the draft, I guess is the simplest way to put it?
No.
All right. So the thought never crossed your mind. Could we explore that further of why you never pondered?
I'm not sure I can give you a real answer. It didn't cross my mind. I think it might have, had I had support from other areas in doing it, but I didn't think about it. I'm not sure whether it was because I was more afraid of leaving the country and not being able to come back than I was of taking my chances. But at this point, 60 odd years later, I'm not sure I can give you a really definitive answer.
So what was so where were you trained before, where were you trained for your service before being sent to Vietnam?
Okay, so the first place they sent me was well, a typical, the Army started off right away not having a clue what they were doing. And so I got my orders from the draft uh, board on Whitehall Street in Manhattan, New York City. And I got tickets to get on a train and a subway token to get up to the train station. I got on the train, met a bunch of other guys, and we got off the train at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, only to discover that they had given us tickets for the wrong train, and we didn't belong in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And so they loaded us all on another train and sent us back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where we were supposed to be. So that was step one with the Army. So I got to Fort Bragg. That's where I was going to do basic. It was Fort Bragg at that time was the home of the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces, the Green Berets. So while we didn't actually interact with them, we probably had a more rigorous basic training than a lot of other places because the drill sergeants were mostly from the 82nd Airborne or from Special Forces. The Army had difficulty in organizing all of this, I suspect because of the huge number of people that were being drafted right away. And so they didn't divide groups up. So we became, there's 4 platoons in every company. We had 4 platoons, and each platoon was from a specific draft board. So everybody that came out of Whitehall Street in Manhattan was one platoon. There was a platoon that was all, and this was, and being from New York City, it was a very mixed platoon of blacks, whites, every ethnic possibility, every religious possibility. There was a platoon out of Washington, D.C., all black, a platoon out of Salisbury, North Carolina, all white, and a platoon out of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all white. However, and I guess I was a little bit surprised, everybody got along fairly well between the platoons, and we went through basic, and it was tough. I wasn't quite prepared for how rigorous it was going to be, but we got through. I don't think anybody of the 144 guys in the company didn't go completely through. The last thing we had to do was run the Green Berets obstacle course, and none of us in the 144 of the 144 guys finished in what was minimal time for the or rather maximum time for the Green Berets, but we all finished. And then I had leave, and from there I went to Fort Dix in New Jersey for what's called advanced infantry training. And I got to tell you, I can't remember anything at all about those 3 weeks. It was just, I assume we did a lot of riflery, et cetera, but I remember basic. And after I left Fort Dix, I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia for radio school. And I remember that pretty clearly, but the 3 weeks in Fort Dix are sort of a blur. And then after radio school, at the end of another, I guess it was 4 or 5 weeks, they lined us up in a big circle in the gymnasium at Fort Gordon, and in alphabetical order. And the lieutenant stood in the middle, pointing, going around, going Vietnam, 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 so that about every 30th or 40th person did not go to Vietnam. They were either assigned to Germany or Korea or someplace else. And then I had leave to go home. And from there, I went to Andrews Air Force Base to be transported by plane to Vietnam. It was snowing. Andrews was socked in, so they transported us up to JFK Airport, and we flew from there in the snow to Alaska in the snow to Narita Air Force Base in Japan in the snow, and arrived at 6 o'clock in the afternoon in Vietnam, and it was 97 degrees and sunny. So that was the first half year. So this was January 1967 that I arrived in Vietnam.
So what was what unit were you a part of when you were training and then eventually deployed to Vietnam?
All right. Well, I was never assigned to any particular unit. So I always went through as an individual because I was a radio teletype operator. And we were not assigned to units. We were deployed where needed when we got to Vietnam. So when I arrived at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, we were taken to Long Binh Junction, commonly known as LBJ, in honor of our illustrious president. And I was assigned to a dispatch unit where we were given a couple of days of indoctrination courses and ideas of what it was like to be in Vietnam, what the weather was like, what living was like. And then I was assigned to a Hawk Missile Battalion, which the headquarters of which was located between Benoit and Saigon.
So that's a good segue into my next question that I want to ask you. So what were you told about what Vietnam would be like, or what the people would be like, or what your objective was?
Well, we were not told much about anything in particular. We were told that our objective was to support the South Vietnamese against the incursion of the North Vietnamese. No mention made of local revolutionaries, the Viet Cong, or anything like that in the briefing. We were told nothing about local people other than we should interact with them as little as possible, but be as friendly as possible. And the one thing that I came away with that was the most interesting was at some point, I guess there were about 25 of us in the room, and the sergeant who was giving the lecture told us all to stand up and look down at our boots, which we did. And he said, that'll be the last time you'll see your boots looking like that. And of course, we all looked at him like, what the hell are you talking about? And he said, well, during the rainy season, you won't see them because they'll be covered with mud. And during the dry season, you won't see them because they'll be covered with dust. And then he gave us a little thing about the weather and how it was never nice. It was always awful. And about mosquitoes and being careful, and that we would be taking anti-malaria medication. I think it was every Monday morning. It would be given out at breakfast. And so that was basically the introduction. The whole thing was two and a half days long before I was assigned to my unit, and a lieutenant came by in a Jeep and picked me up and drove me I guess it was about an hour's ride out to the 56th Artillery.
And so aside from the weather and what you were told, on your first arrival, what were your own first impressions of Vietnam?
It was hot and uncomfortable. It was weird because it was so hot. I guess I was there. This was January, so it was still the dry season. So it would get to be 100 degrees during the day, and it would drop down to 70, 75 at night. There's no humidity. It was very, very dry. So you would be freezing at night, even though it was 70, 75 degrees. So you're sleeping in your full uniform and your flak jacket and a blanket because you were so cold. So it was very weird. It was the drive, I guess, gave me my first idea of the fact that there was very little connection between us and the Vietnamese. We had these big, huge trucks, Jeeps, everything, and they were on motor scooters and tuk-tuks, and horse-drawn or ox-drawn or water buffalo-drawn vehicles. And there were almost no cars that weren't American military cars, other than Vietnamese government cars.
So what were the responsibilities of your position with the 56th Hawk Missile Battalion?
So when I first got there are two radio teletype operators assigned to the unit, and the operation was that you would work 24 hours on, 24 hours off. And so there were two of us and we would alternate. But when I got there, there were still two guys. The guy that was finishing up and rotating back still had 3 weeks to go. So I was assigned to ride shotgun on the mail delivery truck, or three-quarter ton truck. And we would go out every morning and we would drive to the three of the four batteries where the actual missiles were, as well as MACV headquarters in Saigon. So we made 4 stops every day. We went out about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. Mostly it was to deliver orders and mail, and we were usually back about 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was one battery that was stationed out by the first Infantry Division, Big Red 1, I guess they were called. We did not go out to that battery. That battery was in what was called the Iron Triangle, which from day one to the day we left was a combat zone. And so somebody from the Infantry Division would come in and pick up the mail for that battery. And we were not to go out there. So we went to one battery in Benoit, 2 batteries around Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, and to MACV headquarters in Saigon to deliver, pick up mail, get orders, whatever was required for battalion headquarters. And I did that for, I guess, 3 weeks. And then the fellow that was there rotated back, and I started operating the radio teletype machine 24 hours on, 24 hours off for the next 11 months, or what turned out to be 12 months.
So could you go into that a little bit further? What were your responsibilities as the teletype operator? What would a regular day entail from a regular work shift or day entail from that?
All right. So the regular day would entail that I would get up, I guess, about 7, go have breakfast. And sometime between 8 and 9, I would relieve the guy that was on duty. I would change the code in the cryptograph machine. Let me describe a little bit. So there's 2 big machines. There's a radio teletype machine, which is basically a keyboard and a screen, and it works like a typewriter. And then whatever your message is appears on the screen, so you can see it or correct it or whatever you have to do. That is then connected to a encrypting machine, so that the message goes out encrypted. And on the other end, somebody's got the same kind of machine that decodes the message so that it can be read there. And we all have the same set of codes to use every morning. It changes every 24 hours. So that was my job. I got to say that for the first 10 and a half, 11 months, it was reasonably simple. There wasn't a lot going on. We would communicate with our batteries every morning. I would send out the orders of the day from the commanding officer. We would receive our orders in from from both MACV and USRV in Saigon and at Long Binh Junction, and that was basically it. I don't know if you remember the program MASH, but I was sort of radar in that sense. There wasn't much else to do. I got to do a lot of reading, and on my my days off weren't really days off. I would get to have a good portion of the day to myself. I certainly had the nights off on the nights I wasn't working, but they would always finding, odd jobs that we needed to do to help out in battalion headquarters. But it was basically, fortunately for me, a reasonably quiet and thank God until the very end, not a very exciting job.
That's something you'd maybe want to talk about more, talk about how exciting it got in the end. Near the end.
The end was the Tet Offensive. So I'd been there at that point, a little over 11 months. I was scheduled to leave the last week in January. And I don't remember the exact date of when the Tet Offensive started, but I think it was January 27th or 28th. And it started at night. And then the next morning, I happened to be on duty when I got my own message that all flights out of Tan Son Nhut had been canceled, and that they would let me know when I could leave. The offensive in our area went on for 3 or 4 days. We were sort of caught in a crossfire. Next to us, let me describe the topography a little to give you a better idea of what's going on. So the unit itself was in a flat area just off a dirt road that connected to, I think it was Highway 15 that went to Benoit. And then behind the flat area was a hill. And on the hill, in a raise going up the hill, was the radar for the Hawk missiles. We had also a missile repair station assigned to the headquarters. So we had no actual operative missiles at the headquarters battalion. They were all at the batteries. And so alongside the dirt road, there was a village, which we called Widow's Village, because there were never any men under the age of 50 there. So it was only women and children and old people. We had not really a non-relationship with them. Occasionally we would buy fruit and stuff from them, but we had really nothing to do with them. Some of the people from the village worked on the compound as waitresses in the mess hall or doing laundry. So with the opening of the Tet Offensive, out of wherever they came from, whether they were tunnels in the village or from someplace in the woods off in to the southwest, loads of men all of a sudden appeared in the village. And I guess it was the 11th Cavalry, was assigned to protect our battalion. So they were stationed at the top of the hill, protecting the radar and overlooking the battalion to protect us and shooting down into the village. And the village was shooting up at the 11th Cav. Nobody would, and they weren't really shooting at us. They sort of ignored us. I don't know whether they understood that we really didn't have any heavy weapons. We all had M16s, but nothing more. And so our assignment, according to our commander, was to keep low, stay out of range. And so this went on for 4 nights, 3 days. We were hit with some mortar shells. There was some small arms fire. Basically, I guess, to keep us hunkered down, which it succeeded in doing. And eventually, the 11th Cav came down off the hill and occupied Widow's Village. And then 2 days after that, I got notification that in 3 days I was to proceed to Tan Son Nhut and I could fly home. I will say that having not had combat and only having occasional mortar shells or rockets fired at us the first 11 months, to say I was scared shitless those 4 days would be an understatement. But as I say, we didn't really see any direct action during that time.
So what was the journey home like? What did you come home to? If I guess any better way to describe it, it was just like, what were your thoughts upon getting to finally return home?
Well, let's see, the flight home, I didn't go directly home. So the flight home started in Tan Son Nhut. We flew to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, then to Guam, from Guam to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii to Travis Air Force Base in California. So my plan had been, and since I still had 4 months left in the Army, but I had a month's leave before I had to report to Fort Hood in Texas. So I figured I'm on the West Coast. I'll visit my sister and brother-in-law who are living in Los Angeles. So the trip ended as stupidly as it had started. I get to Oakland, to Travis Air Force Base. They process us out, and I've got my vouchers to fly from San Francisco to Los Angeles. So I asked why we're right next to the airport in Oakland. There's no flights from Oakland. You got to take a cab to San Francisco International Airport. Okay. So me and another guy were doing the same trip. We get in the cab. We go take the cab to San Francisco Airport. We get on the flight that we're assigned to, and the flight takes off and lands at Oakland Airport as its first stop. So we spent, anyway, then we flew from Oakland to Los Angeles. And I spent a couple of days with my sister before I flew from Los Angeles to New York to greet the family. And I got off the plane in JFK, and I was walking in, and I walked right past my aunt. She didn't recognize me at all. I had lost something like 30 pounds while I was there, so I was really thin. And so homecoming was, it was great. But I wasn't out of the Army, so it wasn't all over yet. And I knew I still had to go back and spend another 3 months in service.
So if you don't mind, where were those 3 months spent?
Fort Hood, probably the worst. I should have stayed in Vietnam. I thought it was the worst place I've ever been. And I don't know if you follow in the news, but it hasn't gotten any better in these last 50 years. It was just a terrible place. In addition to which, there was nothing. There were, I guess, a company's worth, 144 of us, who had just been in Vietnam, and now we were here. And Fort Hood was the home of the Second Armored Division, but because there were gasoline shortages, because everything was being shipped out to Vietnam, there was nothing. There were no activities. None of the vehicles had gas. There was nothing to, no training, no nothing. We would get we worked Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday washing vehicles in the motor pool. That was our job. And then we had Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. And so Killeen, Texas was not a place that anybody wanted to be, which was the town outside Fort Hood. So as often as we could, we would go to Austin. And a bunch of us had joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War without telling the Army, obviously. And at that time, we worked in Austin for the Gene McCarthy presidential campaign. And that was my last 3 months in the Army.
So you talked about your homecoming was fairly nice, and you talked about earlier how even before you got drafted, you had already had some anti-war sentiment. Do you know how any of your family felt about American involvement in Vietnam, or how they felt about you being in service there?
Well, I would say that the entire family was opposed to what we were doing in Vietnam. I can't think of anybody in the immediate family, aunts or uncles, that were gung ho or happy about the situation. There were some other relatives that thought we were doing the right thing, but not people that I really knew, just relatives. So it was, yeah. So there was support for my position and understanding of what I was doing. And I would guess that by when I came home, everybody was or all the people that I was friendly with, all my relatives were even more convinced of the wrongness of the war.
So, and again, you already talked about earlier how you were very well versed in politics upon your deployment. You knew what was happening was wrong. I would feel like, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but how did being deployed in Vietnam just kind of reinforce your understanding? And
completely. And not only that, I don't know if you ever read the book Catch-22, but you should, when you have the time, you should take the time to read it if you want to understand how really ridiculous the U.S. armed forces can be, and that was also reinforced. As I said, initially they sent us to Fort Jackson instead of Fort Bragg. Coming home, they put me on. I could have not had to take a taxi cab for an hour and a half to get from one airport to another when the plane was actually stopping there. There were all kinds of instances throughout my entire time in the armed forces that I realized how essentially incompetent the operation was. And Prejudice and all kinds of other problems that the military had that they never addressed in any way. So I mean, my first encounter with Prejudice was after I finished basic training and I came to Fort Bragg, the first weekend we were at Fort Bragg, we were told that we weren't going to get passes for the weekend. So without, we weren't going to get passes unless we applied specifically and had a reason to get a pass. So it was the Jewish holidays that weekend. Now, I'm not particularly religious, but it seemed to me a reasonable request to make to take the bus the 2 hours to Fort Bragg from Fort Dix to New York on Friday afternoon and come back in time Sunday night to be there for Monday morning reveille. So me and two other guys applied to the officer of the day. He refused. We were aware that he had already given passes to two other guys who we knew were not Jewish. Anyway, the three of us decided this was stupid. We'd had enough. And so we went AWOL. And we left Friday afternoon on the bus, came back Sunday night on the bus. And Monday morning, of course, the captain calls us into the office to read us the riot act, and to consider whether we should be court-martialed or given some punishment. And I made it pretty clear to him that if in fact they, I understood that he had to do something because we had violated the rules, but that I firmly believed that the reason that this had happened was because the guy was anti-Semitic and didn't want to let us go because people that weren't Jewish had been given leave for what I thought were less important reasons. So he didn't say anything, and he gave the three of us an Article 15, which is just a punishment, and told us we couldn't go on leave for the next 2 weekends. That was all he did. And then the guy that had been the officer of the day disappeared altogether from the unit. So I'm assuming that he did something as far as punishing that guy also. But that was, this is, I'd been in the Army, 3 months. And so, this was the situation. And I'll say that I certainly was glad I wasn't black, because they got much worse treatment in many cases, especially when we were in the South. And many of them didn't go on leave because of that. Didn't take, weekends off that were offered. They didn't go because it was better on base.
Do you have any other examples of just that type of prejudice that was very prevalent in the Army at the time? One could even argue that there's still issues regarding that now, but do you just know any other examples off the top of your head of similar situations like that happening?
Well, there was the first commander, the first battalion commander that we had at when I was in Vietnam, frequently gave the cruddy jobs. I mean, one of the things that we had to do is the base is surrounded by concertina wire as a protective, and it's 2 rows. So there's an area in between the 2 rows of concertina wire that need to be kept clean, and the grass kept low. And that job invariably went to blacks and Puerto Ricans, as opposed to the white guys. I mean, if you went out and looked, now when the new commander came in after 6 months or so, that all changed. And he made up a work list, and everybody spent the same amount of time out in between the fences, keeping it clean and so so that was pretty obvious that this guy, the first guy, was and I also know that the guy that was there was a guy there who was the lieutenant. He was in charge of communications. He was basically my boss, and he went out of his way to ensure that those of us in the communications divisions were always white. Now, he left only after 3 months, and the guy that replaced him, who was a guy that I remember because he was really sharp, was Lieutenant Isle, and he had no favorites. He was an open and honest guy, and he was a pleasure to work for.
All right. So you talked about how your last 3 months in the service, you'd actually already joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. How did you come to be a part of that?
I guess it was during the first trip to Austin, after I'd gotten to Fort Hood, that I went to work in the Eugene McCarthy campaign, and there were a bunch of other Vietnam veterans there, and they talked up joining this group, and I decided that was the right thing to do.
Would you be willing to go into that further?
Well, I mean, it was, I was opposed to the war. I was back now. And I thought that we were not even looking, as far as I could tell, in the right direction as far as solving this war, this problem that we had created. I was sure that as much as I would have liked McCarthy to win, I was pretty sure he wasn't going to. And so I was looking for another organization that I could work with in trying to convince the public and the politicians that we were making a big mistake and we needed to get out of this.
So you talked about some of your colleagues on base at Fort Hood that also joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Do you know of anyone that you might have served with in Vietnam that like held those similar ideas?
No. We didn't, while we were in Vietnam, while we were on active duty in Vietnam, there was very little political talk. I think, and I only know this from what I've read about the war and talked to some people that served later, that it wasn't until after 1968, which, if I remember the figures correctly, was the worst year for American casualties of the entire period. It wasn't until after that there was a lot of anti-war sentiment that was openly voiced among the troops in Vietnam. During the period of time that I was there, I would say that there was one other guy in the battalion that I knew of that felt the same way that I did. And I think that, if I remember right, he had the opposite point of view when he arrived. And I remained friends with him he was the only person that I remained friends with after I came back. Or actually, he remained friends with me since he sought me out.
So, during your time with as part of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, how did you participate as part of that? Like, what were you? Do you have any specific responsibilities? I guess just what did you do during your time with them?
Well,
As part of that.
I did some anti-war demonstrations. Um, More recently, since I'm still a member, more recently I've shared my poetry, which has been published in their newspaper. Back then, mostly I participated in events and gave money to the organization.
So what was your experience during that time interacting with the greater public, with regular civilians in that time? I guess depending on what was the reception? I know it gradually changed over time as more and more of the country heard about what was actually going on in the war, but like just what was that overall public reception that from you personally received?
Um, Glad you're back. I know a lot of soldiers felt mistreated when they returned. I didn't feel that way, even amongst my friends that were uh, opposed to the war. I and I came home. I got married. I went to work. I went back to work. I went to school, uh, and I carried on with my life. And I guess to a large extent, I buried what had, and didn't discuss, certainly initially, what life was like in the army or in Vietnam. I did go out on a number of occasions to school in the out on Long Island where I had gone to school to do slideshows about Vietnam and to share my feelings about it. I will say that the administrations in the two or three schools that I did go to were fine with me telling my side of the story and my opinions about going on. Now, my photographs are really not, and purposely so, not war photographs, but are photographs of Vietnam and the people. And so that was what I was trying to get across, to, I guess, offset the kind of uh, publicity that the press and the government gave about, quote unquote, ooks. And my goal was to express to these kids that these were real people, and that we were destroying their lives, and this was wrong.
So, what did you feel? What did you think when eventually America did pull out of Vietnam? Just what were your initial thoughts? I guess when there was a sense of that the war was over.
Well, there was it's hard. I mean, I thought we did a extremely poor job of managing the war and an even worse job of managing our leaving. Um, but it was obvious politically that we were either going to cut and run or we were going to stay there. There was no in between. That the U.S. they weren't willing to spend any more money. and so this was going to be the only way we were going to get out. I thought we did a poor job of negotiating a peace, if that's what you want to call it. And once again, just as from the beginning, we really didn't care about what happened to the Vietnamese. In the beginning, we had our political goal that we wanted to, quote unquote, stop communism, stop the domino theory, all of that crap. And at the end, we just wanted to get our people out and stop spending money. And we didn't care what happened. And I don't know, I guess I mean, I felt that we betrayed the people, that we had created this horror show for them, and we didn't do anything in our negotiations for peace and for us leaving to protect them from what might happen afterwards.
So I guess that would lead into just how much of have you thought on much of, especially years after the war ended? Did you ever think on? Did you ever think back to your time in Vietnam, or did you still? What did you continually do even long after the war ended as part of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War?
Well, as I said, I've written for their newspaper, and I basically, for most of the time after the war, I was here. I was over for me. I did what I could through the Vietnam veterans, but I now had a family to raise, and that became what was important to me. It wasn't, but I always wanted to go back. I mean, it took a long time before I was able to get together the necessary funds, et cetera, to go spend time there. So in 2007, which was now 40 years after I had been there, I went back and did a 3-week tour of Vietnam, starting in the north in Hanoi. I was very impressed with what they had done to come out of this. The people there were extremely nice. But of course, as somebody there, one of the guys there pointed out, we won, so we can afford to be nice to you guys now. And it was a wonderful trip, and I made friends, Vietnamese friends that I've stayed friendly with over the years, through emails and now through Facebook. I've worked with them on some projects of theirs. One group is a travel agency, and they also own an art gallery. So I've done some translating from Vietnamese English into American English for them on their brochures and their websites, and stayed in touch with them. My wife and I went back in 2019 and spent some time with them in Hanoi, and visited northern Vietnam, where I had never been before. We didn't go to the last trip.
So I guess just to delve a little further, what was that experience like, just returning to Vietnam?
Well, arriving in Hanoi was like, visiting any country you'd never been to, because I'd never been there. So the first half of the trip, which was Hanoi, Hue, the northern part of Vietnam, And then places I had not been when I was in the service, like Da Nang and Hoi An. That was just like a trip, visiting other country, to see the sights, see the people. It was flying into Saigon, arriving by plane into Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, as I had 40 years ago, that I felt some queasiness about being back. The very first thing we did when we arrived in Saigon was to visit the War Remnants Museum, which is Saigon, which is Vietnam's museum about war, obviously from their perspective. The guide, who had had previous experience with veterans who found it very, very uncomfortable, had suggested that if I wanted to, I didn't have to go through, but I did. It was mostly photographs of what had happened in Vietnam between 1963 and 1975. So it was about the American Vietnamese War rather than the French Vietnamese War. And it was difficult to remember and to go through, but it wasn't terrible. And then visiting Saigon was sort of nostalgic. It was not the same city as it had been when I was there. And I mean, now all the streets were paved. Now everybody had cars and bicycles and things. You know, it was like any other Asian city. At some point, we were going to drive from Saigon up into the mountains to Dalat, which was a resort city. And so I asked the guide if we could swing past where I thought I remembered our compound was. And we looked it up and we found the intersections on the streets where Widow's Village had been and where our compound was. And so we drove up to Dalat, passing that location, and there was an apartment house and a mini mall where I had been stationed. So, and as I say, it had taken us when I was stationed there. It would take us somewhere about an hour or so to get to either Saigon or Ben Hoa. We were located in between the two. Now with the big new highways, it took about a half hour. And of course, all of the military bases and everything there were gone. There were a lot less rice paddies and more housing and manufacturing buildings all along the highway.
So I guess that would kind of lead into do you have an opinion on the years after the decades after Vietnam, with efforts to remember by both Vietnam and the United States, the efforts to just look to remember and look back on the war, and I guess what was done, or the lack of what wasn't done for those who fought on both sides of the war.
Well, I certainly felt that the United States was remiss in the way it handled everything for the first, and of course, so was Vietnam, because we both played this game of, we were still enemies, so to speak. They were no better in dealing with the outcome of the war than we were. I thought the North was wrong in the way they mistreated the people of the South who had fought, and there should have been more of an amnesty kind of thing. And I thought that our attitude up until the late 1980s was wrong. I think that we have also been terribly remiss in not compensating Laos and Cambodia for the horrible destruction that we did there. And it's as if that part of the war, which was secret and which we didn't ever talk about then and don't talk about now, um, we have we did essentially, I don't remember who said it, but we did essentially bond them back into the Middle Ages and never helped them recover at all. Whereas we did help once we renewed relationships. We did help the Vietnamese to help rebuild their cities and their infrastructure, which we did not do for Cambodia or Laos.
So then I guess another question would be just how do you feel about like America's way of remembering Vietnam?
Well, I think our way of remembering all wars doesn't do anything to help us not have more wars. Um, everybody's a hero. Everybody was wonderful. Everybody did great things, which we didn't, and which we weren't, and which we aren't. And so I'm not a big fan of remembering wars as if we did great things and everybody that fought in the war was a hero. Everybody that fought in the war did what they had to do as a citizen of this country. And I don't know that. And I thought I thought that the original Vietnam memorial was the best way to honor those that had died there, and that was it. That was the end. That was the way you commemorated it. And then the other way to do is to remember that we don't want to do that again. We don't want to get involved in somebody else's civil war, which is something we obviously don't remember.
You've talked a couple times about the poetry you've written about Vietnam. How did you come to start doing that?
Well, I've always liked poetry. I've been writing poetry since high school, which I shared with nobody except me. At some point, my wife pointed out to me that there was a group at Fordham, and I guess this goes back 10 years almost, that there was a group at Fordham that was a veterans writing workshop. And she thought that I should get involved. And so I did. I went and I shared my poetry with these veterans, and they shared their stories and their poetry. And I felt more comfortable with sharing the poetry and those things with other people, which I did. As I say, I published some of it in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War newspaper. I made what they call chapbooks about my 2 visits to Vietnam, one as in the Army and one as a civilian. And most of the poetry comes from memory or from a sort of diary that I kept, also with notes, and some sort of poems that I never really finished. And so almost all the poetry is the finished poems are more recent.
So just what would you like to say to just anyone who knows just, and what would you like to say just about your experience during as a veteran of Vietnam, as someone who spoke out against the war, as just someone who participated in that moment in history?
Well, I it's hard to say. We are, and this is not just the United States, it's almost every country in the world is never willing to admit exactly how horrific any war is, whatever side you're on. We have been fortunate in our history that, with the exception of the Civil War and the terrorist attacks of 9/11, we have never ever been attacked on our own land. So we don't know what it's like and how horrible what the horrible results of wars are on the civilians. Forget about the soldiers who are there, they're fighting, they're there for quote unquote, whatever reason it is, their various governments are sending them there. But the civilians aren't there for that reason. And in many of these countries, the civilians never had a choice. And they're the ones that suffer the most. And that's the story that nobody ever tells about what it's like to be in war. We never see war movies that are dedicated to the civilians who survived. I mean, now, I think for the first time, because of what's going on in Ukraine, people are getting to see a real view of how horrific war is to those people that are not participating in it.
Is there anything else you would like to add or you would like to ask?
No, unless you want to hear some funny stories about the war and how silly it can be.
If it's something you would feel like sharing.
I'll tell you, this is one. I mean, and at some point somewhere, I wrote a very short story about 10 lines about it. But we were, and this gives you an idea of what it's like to be in combat, and then how dumb, or how not dumb, but how people use these things to aggrandize themselves. As I say, we were on this compound. Widow's Village was to one side. There was a mountain up to the other side, and on the third, and then a road with the concert on one side, and on the other side was a Michelin rubber plantation. One night, for whatever reason, somebody on guard duty on that side started firing into the rubber plantation. And almost everybody on that side started firing. As soon as that guy started firing, everybody else started firing into the rubber plantation. There was no fire coming back at us. So finally, the officer in charge, the officer of the day, called for a ceasefire. Everything calmed down. Everybody went back to sleep. Everybody started relaxing. And the next morning, the commanding officer asked to put together a group to go out into the rubber plantation and see what was going on. So I was off that day, so I got picked to join this captain and a lieutenant, and I don't know, about 10 or 12 of us. And we went out into the rubber plantation, and we found nothing but dead rubber trees and wounded rubber trees and all of that. And we came back, we reported to the commanding officer what we found, what went on, what we thought happened. And okay, he says, fine. The next day, I'm on duty, and I get this communique from the commanding officer to send off to MACV in Saigon. And the communique said that we were under fire. We had we had a firefight the night before against unseen enemy in the rubber plantation. We took no injuries, and we could not find any injured Viet Cong or North Vietnamese or whatever. And which, of course, was nobody shot at us. There was no firefight. We just shot into it. And so, but that's what he sent off, because he had to account for the ammunition, and it looked good on his record. The next day, they came and napalmed the rubber plantation, so that it wasn't there, and quote unquote, whoever had been hiding there that night before couldn't hide there again. So now that was a completely, vastly open area. And we could see for miles now. It was nice, but it was just, another reason, no reason for what happened. And it's war. You're jumpy. You're nervous. Maybe he saw what he thought was somebody out there. Maybe he saw an animal of some kind, a large animal, a tiger or an elephant, of which there still were some in Vietnam then. But that was that. And then my first night riding shotgun to the garbage dump. So every afternoon we would police the area, clean up all the garbage, put it in the back of a 2.5 ton truck, and drive out to this huge dump that we had created, like a landfill kind of thing. And we would dump the garbage over the edge down into the landfill. But you had to have somebody ride shotgun with the garbage guys, for two reasons. One, you didn't want to get attacked by the Viet Cong. And two, there were always tigers scrounging around in the garbage dump. So that was a little added excitement.
Anything else you would like to add or say?
Nope. I think that's it, unless you have any other questions.
I don't think I do, sir. So, Mr. David Sandgrund, again, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your story about your involvement in Vietnam. And again, just thank you so much for this.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you, Aiden.